thank you guys for having me back. I really enjoyed getting to be with you last time. I might have even said this last time, but I really admire what you guys are doing. It's just taking time out of your week to come study the Bible and theology and to try to get better at being able to know God and to discern His will in doing those things. And so, thank you for welcoming me again and just allowing me to be a part of this really wonderful thing that you guys have going on here. I wanted to just spend some time talking about adoption language in Paul. This is something that's really Paul actually doesn't use adoption language very much. He actually only uses the word itself. In his letters, the word itself only appears 4 times. Uh, and um, and then the concept is a little bit, it has a little bit more prevalence than that. We'll get into that in just a second. But the word's not very often used in Paul. But um, man, like if you listen to kind of more contemporary worship music and stuff like that, we really like the imagery of adoption, right? A lot of contemporary worship music uses it. I hear it talked a lot about from pulpits and things like that. And so I wanted to just dive into what does Paul mean when he says the word adoption? Um, Okay, and so just to kind of open us up and get us warmed up and talking a little bit, so what are the first things that come to mind for you when you hear the word adoption? Acceptance? I'm sorry? Inclusion. Okay, okay. Yeah. Sure, sure. Children, yeah. Sure. Absolutely. Calm? Absolutely. Sure. 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 Okay, value. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Loved. Absolutely. Sure, sure, sure. Yeah, we kind of metaphorize the process of adoption to kind of talk about taking on things that aren't germane to us, right? Something that's foreign to us that we kind of make our own, right? Absolutely, that's kind of a metaphorizing of adoption there. Yeah, yeah. Chosen, yeah, yeah, yeah. Not belonging to belonging. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So, because and let's get concrete here for a second. Who is usually adopted? Children, orphans, right? Yeah. So in our society in particular, orphans are the primary adoptees, right? Or um, people who do have parents, but their parents are not able to take care of them for some reason. They're absent in jail. Um, yeah, just incapacitated for whatever reason, right? Yeah. And so I think because of that, and rightly so, like when we hear the word adoption, we tend to take what we know about our kind of adoption processes and project that onto what Paul is talking about, right? And so we like in contemporary worship music and stuff like that, there's the image of God taking in the orphan a lot, right? And we kind of conflate that with adoption language, right? And I don't want to. I think there's an incredible amount of validity to those images, right? That, especially you look at the Psalms and stuff like that. Dude, God does care for the orphan and the widow, right? That God does love people who don't belong, right? And so there's a lot of validity to that. And so I don't want to discount any of those things. I don't think there's anything uh, doctrinally wrong with kind of projecting our own images of adoption onto God ultimately. I think there's actually a lot right about that, right? God does love us as his children, and he does take us in if we're, or, as if we're orphans, right? And stuff like that. And so, but I do just want to kind of put forward that's probably not what Paul mainly meant when he used the language of adoption. And so we're going to get into why that is, right? So adoption in Roman society and literature, right? Adoption and kind of the language of adoption was not actually used when talking about taking in orphans or even taking in children in general, young children in general. The language of adoption was actually used for adults. Children were almost never adopted, or at least children from outside of existing families, right? And so the primary people who were kind of the beneficiaries of adoption, especially if it was someone going from one family into another family, were adults. And the reason for that is because adoption didn't really concern taking orphans and giving them families, right? In fact, actually, most people who were adopted had existing families, like they had parents, right? Really, adoption concerned issues of inheritance, right? And so it wasn't about providing an orphan with parents. It was actually about providing a Roman father with a viable heir. It was about a Roman father having someone to pass his property to. In pagan Roman families in particular, it concerned having someone to kind of look after family gods. And making sure that there was someone there to kind of manage the father's estate after he was gone. And making sure there was someone there to kind of preserve the high status, maybe, if it was a Roman family who had high status, that the heir was responsible actually for preserving that status for the family, right? And so this wasn't primarily about giving orphans a family. It was actually about giving a Roman father a viable heir. So someone to pass his inheritance to. But then there's this other kind of strand of Roman literature where this theme shows up a lot, that adoption is actually used to discipline existing heirs. And so there's actually some like really dramatic texts that depict heirs not acting correctly in a Roman family, right? They're not acting worthily of their father in some way, or they're not obeying their father's wishes in some way. And so the father, as kind of this last-ditch effort to try to get them to shape up and act worthily of their inheritance, actually either threatens to or actually does adopt another heir into the family in order to make his existing heir feel threatened. Right? And the idea was kind of, if that heir feels threatened, like, oh, this guy's going to come in and actually take the inheritance that's supposed to belong to me, then maybe they'll wake up and shape up and start acting according to their father's wishes, right? And so we're going to kind of look at how these different themes show up in Paul's letters and how Paul is kind of drawing on what's available to him in the kind of world around him to kind of shape his arguments in Romans in particular. And so the first thing that I want to look at is kind of the moral side of heirship, right? And so we're going to look at Romans 8:12 through 17. Paul writes, "So then, brothers and sisters, we are debtors, not to the flesh, in order to live according to the flesh. For if y'all live according to the flesh, you are about to die. But if by the Spirit you kill the practices of the body, you will live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. For y'all did not receive the spirit of slavery, leading to fear, but y'all received a spirit of adoption, in which we cry, Abba, Father. And the Spirit itself witnesses together with our spirit that we are children of God. And if we are children, we are also heirs, heirs of God, and co-heirs with Christ, if we co-suffer, in order that we might also be co-glorified. Okay, so this first passage that we're looking at is speaking about adoption as a present reality. Adoption in the present means that you are sons right now. And so adoption actually forges a familial connection with God in the present, right? Between those who believe and God himself. The people who actually receive, right, this spirit of adoption that Paul speaks of, now cry out to God as Father. And this is significant in particular for Gentiles, right? Because Gentiles would have actually had other gods that they would have been related to, right? And so Paul's writing to people in Rome. Paul's writing to a primarily, if not exclusively, Gentile audience in Rome. And so these are people who would have grown up with familial connections to other gods that were not the God of Israel. Right? And what Paul is saying is actually the spirit that you've now received as you've believed in Jesus has actually created this familial connection between you and this other God, this God of Israel. The familial connection between you and these other gods that you used to worship, that's been broken. And now God has adopted you as his children. So you cry out to him as your Father. Right? And what that means, if you're children, is that you stand to inherit from God. You stand to actually inherit what belongs to God himself. The same things that he's given to his Son. You as sons along with his Son, receive what belongs to God. And we'll get into what that looks like in just a second here. But these are kind of the family dynamics that are created by this adoption, right? God is your Father. You are his sons or his children. And actually Christ, as Paul will say later, is your co-heir or your brother. Right? And so what does that mean for kind of present moral behavior, right? Well, being an heir in a family carried with it moral obligations. And so it freed you from certain moral obligations and actually tied you to others, right? And so one reason that you could kind of adopt in the Roman world was actually if your family was in an incredible amount of debt, your children actually stood to inherit that debt, right? But if you kind of adopted one of your children out to somebody else, right? If they were adopted into another family, they would actually be free of your family's debt, and they would inherit the wealth of that new family instead, right? And so adoption was actually a way to kind of free maybe one of your children from the heavy debt that was on your family. And so when Paul talks about when Paul's kind of exhorting his congregation in Rome morally, it's like, you are debtors, not to the flesh. He's actually drawing on concepts related to adoption. Right? It's like, you used to belong to this family that was in heavy debt, and you stood to inherit that debt. But God adopted you and freed you out from under that debt. Right? And so you were debtors to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. But you're not anymore. So don't live like you still are. Right? Don't live according to the flesh. because if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, the practice of the body, you will live. Right? And so Paul is exhorting his people to stop living one way, to stop living sinfully, to stop living in obedience to the gods that they used to worship, and to start living in accordance with actually what the Spirit is doing in them, the spirit of adoption that cries out to God. And so he exhorts them to kill the practices of the body. Well, what does that mean? Well, Paul gives us some lists in certain places, right? And so in particular, in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, and Galatians 5, 19 through 21. And Paul lists out all these practices that are fleshly practices, right? Things that Christians need to stop doing. And it's really interesting because actually in both of these passages, he talks about the people who do these things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Right? And so again, we get this language of inheritance, which is related to the adoption of believers, right? And so what Paul is telling his people is, hey, God has adopted you into his family. It is now really important that you don't do these things that would keep you from coming into your inheritance. Right? As God's sons, as God's children, you stand to inherit from him unless you do these things. Right? And so what the language that Paul uses in Romans 8:13, hey, make sure you put to death the practices of the body by the Spirit. Be violent against those actions, against those desires, against those practices that would keep you from coming into your inheritance. Right? And that this is something that because you're already sons, God has empowered you to do this. That's what the reception of the Spirit means for you. You have been empowered to put to death the deeds of the body. You have been empowered to act as God's good children. And so acting like God's heirs means killing, putting to death the practices of the body, those things which would mean living according to the flesh. There's the ones that get a lot of airtime, right? There's the sins that are more sexual in nature. But there's also greed and theft and anger and quarrelsomeness, right? Jealousy. And what Paul is saying is be violent against those things because that behavior is not in accordance with what it looks like to live as God's sons. It is not in accordance with what it looks like to live as heirs. So acting like God's heirs also looks like suffering with Christ. And so there's this really interesting statement in 8:17, right? Here, I'll go back to it here. And if we are children, we are also heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if we co-suffer in order that we might also be co-glorified. And Paul puts a condition on this, right? You being an heir along with Christ comes with the condition that you suffer with Christ. You being co-glorified with Christ comes with the demand that you suffer with him. Right? And I don't think that this is suffering for suffering's sake, right? God doesn't like suffering. He doesn't just like subjecting people, especially his people, his children, to suffering. But it is part of the reality of the world that we live in, right? And in particular, it's part of the reality of obeying God in the world that we live in. And I think that this is made clear in particular in another passage which kind of pulls on this imagery of adoption. And so Ephesians is one of the other places that Paul uses adoption language, Ephesians 1:4. But later in the letter, after already talking about how these believers have been adopted into God's family, he says this: "Therefore become imitators of God as beloved children. Y'all also walk in love, just as Christ also loved us and offered himself for us as an offering and sacrifice to God for a pleasing aroma." And so being adopted into a new family meant imitating the father of that family. Being adopted into a new family meant imitating the father of that family, because that father was the ruler of that family, right? He embodied what that family was all about. And so your responsibility as his heir was actually to take that torch from him when he died, right? To carry on what that family was about, right? The heroism that the father embodied in some way, right? The morality, the virtue that father embodied. You were then supposed to embody that virtue. And Paul's drawing on that concept here, right? That you've been drawn into God's family. So you imitate the father of that family, God himself. And we get to see the kind of God, the kind of father that God is. We get to see that most clearly in the giving of Jesus. We get to see the way that he loved us, the way that he loved the world in his giving of his son, in the offering of Jesus. That Jesus gave himself over, that he suffered, not for suffering's sake, but out of deep love for us. He gave his life. And so what Paul is saying is, now that you've been adopted into this new family, your responsibility is to imitate that father. That father who loves like that. That father who subjects himself and his son to suffering for the sake of you. For the sake of the love that he has for you. And in imitating God in this way, you will suffer. We will suffer. Love costs, right? That if we really open our ears to the need of the people around us, it's going to mean entering into the hurt of other people. It's going to mean meeting the needs of other people. It's going to mean giving ourselves for the good of other people. And so, being an heir to what belongs to God, it does not mean suffering for suffering's sake, but it does mean suffering and imitating our Father. Suffering in loving the people around us and giving ourselves in order to do so. This is hard. This is hard. And so what Paul does next is he points us forward. It's like, what is our hope in all that? What do we actually get out of this, right? What do we get out of this? If our lot kind of in the here and now is to suffer. And so he points ahead. I consider that the sufferings of the present time are not worthy of comparison to the glory that is about to be revealed for us. For the creation eagerly awaits the revelation of the sons of God. For to futility the creation was subjugated, not willingly, but on account of the one who subjugated it, in the hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its slavery to rot into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that all creation wails together and together suffers the pain of childbirth even until now. Not only this, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, wail inwardly, waiting for our adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope which is seen is not hope. Who hopes for what they see? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait with endurance. Right? And so we actually start, Paul acknowledges that adoption is a present reality, right? It has changed the family that you're in. But Paul also points forward to the future hope of adoption. Adoption is also this reality that kind of awaits future fulfillment. And it addresses the problem that he kind of started to touch on in the last passage, right? And the problem that he spells out here is that creation is in slavery to rot. A lot of our English translations say like decay, right? Or something akin to that. I use rot here because it's this kind of visceral word, right? We all know what rotting something smells like. Even if it's just rotting vegetables, right? Just forget something in the back of the fridge and you pull it out and it's unpleasant, right? And it's interesting. We actually have little pictures of the decay of all creation sitting in the back of our refrigerators. But there's much worse pictures of that, right? I mean, we sanitize our environment to a certain extent, right? We don't encounter rotting bodies very often, either animals or humans. But that is the reality for every body. Every animal, every human dies, and something awful happens to the body. Right? It starts being consumed literally by bacteria. And the smell is almost unbearable. And it putrefies, and it's disgusting, and rightly so, because it's the end of the good life that God has created. And so what Paul says is that this is actually a sign that things are profoundly wrong. This is a result of sin. That all of creation, humanity and non-human creation, is actually subject to this rot, to this decay. And that it's both physical and moral, and the two are intertwined. That all of creation is disintegrating, falling apart, it's being consumed, it's rotting because of sin. And so what Paul says is, actually, we experience this, right, very viscerally. Like we experience this suffering that's resulting from creation itself being subject to rot, right? That we experience it in our own bodies. From something as simple as the aches and pains of getting older to the seriousness of cancer and the death of loved ones, and watching someone that you care about, you watching their brain deteriorate. And it's awful, right? This is like all of creation just wails under this weight. The ache of existence sometimes, you know? And what Paul, I think what Paul says is that this is actually humanity's fault. If we point back to Romans 5 in particular, right, that it's actually Adam's sin that welcomed the rule, the reign of sin and death over creation itself. And it's for that reason, right? Adam's sin and then our participation in that sin after him, right? That every one of us participates in that because we also sin. And so we just continuously, generation after generation, reinstantiate that reign and rule of death over all of creation. And so Paul says we as humans, and actually the entirety of creation, wails under this awful weight, this slavery to rot. And so what does creation cry out for? What do we cry out for? What are we looking forward to? And Paul's answer is the revelation of the sons of God. And so that's us. that's we who have been adopted. Right? And so to talk about this, we have to talk a little bit about the relation between the Son of God, right, Jesus himself, and sons of God, right? That Jesus, even now, has actually been raised from the dead and seated at the right hand of the Father, right? That he actually rules from there. And what Paul is actually pointing forward to is the day where we will actually come to participate in that rule. That Jesus rules over creation, and when we're raised from the dead, he actually shares that with us. And so that's the adoption that Paul is talking about in this passage in particular. It's actually a future adoption where it's like we have the first bits of that now, but that's when it actually becomes complete. That's when we're actually installed as full inheritors, as heirs over creation, where we come to share in Jesus' own rule over the universe. And it's paired in this passage with the redemption of our bodies, right? And so you're right, we're longing for this moment where we're adopted, and Paul kind of gives an aside. It's like, adoption, when our bodies are redeemed. And the moment of redemption of our bodies, right, when we're resurrected from the dead, just like Jesus was resurrected from the dead, that's the moment that our bodies themselves, right, these things that are now subject to decay, now subject to moral and physical rot to a certain extent. The moment of redemption of our bodies is actually when God frees us from that decisively. That we've been empowered to overcome that to a certain extent now. But the moment of redemption of our bodies is when God actually frees us from that completely. That our bodies will no longer be subject to moral decay or physical decay. Bless you. And it's that moment, right, when our bodies are decisively freed from those things that we'll actually be able to become good rulers over the universe like we were always supposed to be. That we'll participate in the life of Christ in such a way that we'll be able to rule with him. We'll be able to rule well over creation in a way that doesn't bring destruction and death, but goodness and life. Right, so this actually ties into Romans 4. I won't get too deep into that, right? But Romans 4 actually talks about the fatherhood of Abraham for all believers. And so he really focuses in on these promises that were given originally to Abraham, right? And the question that's kind of raised in Romans 4 is like, well, do these promises that were given to him, do they belong to only the circumcised, right? Only the people that descended from Abraham in a fleshly way and kept his covenant by being circumcised just like he was? Or do they belong also to the foreskinned, right? That is, the Gentiles. And Paul's answer to that ultimately is like, well, let's look at when Abraham actually received the promise. Did he receive it after he was circumcised, or did he receive it in foreskin while he still had his foreskin? And it's like, well, while he still had his foreskin, actually. And so what this allows for is that Abraham can actually become the father of those who still bear their foreskin, but who believe like he did. So, Gentiles. Right? People who are not Israelites. So, us. Right? Or most of us, I assume. So that we who believe, just like Abraham did, without converting ethnically into Israelites or to Jews, right? That we actually become Abraham's children, and therefore stand to inherit what belongs to Abraham, what was given to Abraham at first. But what was this? Romans 4:13 actually tells us, right, that Abraham was actually promised the world. So if you go back to Genesis, like that's a little hard to find. In fact, it's not there. So essentially what you get, right, Abraham is promised a particular land, and just as time went on, and in combination with other scriptures, in particular Psalm 2, where you have God's king, who's anointed to be king of the world, essentially, right? He actually inherits the nations, right? And so you get kind of the combination of these different texts, and eventually what you end up with is a lot of Jews at the time of Paul, a lot of Jewish authors, understood the original land promise to have expanded to actually encompass the entire earth, right? And so Paul is actually picking up on this tradition. It's like, actually, what Abraham was promised was the whole world. And so those who are his children stand to inherit that from him. Right? It also ties into Romans 5:12 through 21, right? This is where Paul is contrasting Adam on the one hand and Jesus on the other as kind of these archetypal humans, or the founding fathers of kind of their respective humanities, right? Old, sinful, dying humanity through Adam, and new, righteous, immortal humanity through Jesus, right? And so, right, through Adam comes the reign of sin and death over humanity, right? And on the other hand, you actually have Christ's one act of righteousness, his obedience to God, even unto death. Through that, what Romans 5:17 says, believers actually come to reign. So the sin of the one man, Adam, led to the reign of sin and death over humanity. The one act of righteousness, carried out by Jesus himself actually led to the reign of believers through grace. Okay, and so the ultimate kind of effect of knowing this, right? This clarifies our hope as Christians, as those in Christ, as those adopted as sons of God and sons of Abraham, right? And so what this does, I think, is it helps us endure suffering, right? That's what this passage is about. Paul is comparing the present sufferings on the one hand to the future glory to be revealed. And what Paul actually says is it's not even worth comparing. The future glory is so much better than the present suffering is bad. And so if we can set our hope on that completely, and understand that that lasts forever, and it's going to be better than we can ever imagine, then we can hold up. We can persevere through the suffering that, when it's all said and done, is not going to last very long. It also helps us avoid evil, right? And so tied up in the suffering language, right, is like you can avoid suffering in the present, and you can do that in all sorts of ways that are bad for other people. Right? It's a lot easier and usually requires a lot less suffering of you if you avoid other people's suffering. And actually, right? I mean, if you look at, I don't know, the state of politics, not only here, but around the world, or the state of just kind of various economies around the world, right? You can make a lot of money by exploiting other people. You can keep a lot more in your pocket if you give less to your employees. You can put a lot more in your pocket if you tax people unfairly. Or if you use your government power to exploit others, right? And we can all be complicit in this, right? We can all alleviate our own suffering by just kind of being like, you know what? I'm in this for me. Like, if I can alleviate my own suffering, who really cares about what it does to other people? And so we can side with the powers that be and avoid suffering ourselves. But if we hope in the future, right? If we hope for the day when that is corrected, if we hope for the day where God judges the evil powers in the world, right? The powers that exploit other people, it helps us stay on the right side. It helps us to be able to say, you know what? I'm going to put myself in harm's way in order to help other people. I'm going to give of myself in ways that are uncomfortable to me because it means caring for others instead of alleviating my own suffering, right? And this last thing is kind of a weird one, but it's from Paul, so it's fine. So you need to act like everything belongs to you. That's kind of a weird one, right? And so, because we can probably immediately think of like, oh, people, like I know people who have a lot and they're actually not super pleasant because they like to throw that in my face, right? Or they like to let everybody around them know that they have more than them, right? And actually what Paul would say is like, they're not acting like they have everything. In fact, they're being very needy, right? And so they're actually, what they're doing is they're trading what they do have for things that they don't have. They're trading their material wealth for social capital, right? Or they're trying to. They're trying to coerce you into liking them by throwing in your face that they have a lot of fancy things, right? And so this is what Paul, we're going to shift over to 1 Corinthians for just a second, right? So Paul is writing into a kind of a messy congregation, right? A congregation in which there seems to be a lot of quarrels that have grown up, right? A lot of people who are kind of fighting amongst themselves, a lot of people who have kind of pledged their allegiance to certain leaders and have said because of that, it's like, well, I follow this person, so I'm better than you, right? So we actually have the real wisdom because we follow this guy, right? Well, we have the real wisdom because we follow this guy, right? And so they try to kind of exert this social clout over everyone else by saying, like, we follow this leader, right? And so this is part of Paul's moral exhortation not to do that. It's very surprising. He says, let no one deceive themselves. If anyone seems to be wise among you in this age, let them become a fool in order that they might be wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God. So, and he quotes a couple of scriptures there, but so let no one boast in people, for all things are y'all's. All things belong to you. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all things are y'all's. And y'all are Christ's, and Christ is God's. Paul does something weird here, right? Like, you don't boast in anything human. Why? Because you own everything already. You don't need to try to exert yourself over other people. It belongs to you already. You don't need to try and lay claim to it by some weird flex, right? It already belongs to you, so act like it. And he seems to actually be drawing on some kind of common thinking about what constitutes a good ruler. And so this is from a philosopher named Dio Chrysostom. And so I think it just reflects what Paul is talking about here and kind of expands on a little bit, I think, of what he's doing, right? So Dio says, on the other hand, the good ruler, such as you are, right? He's writing to a ruler of some kind, right? Practices the opposite conduct. He covets nothing. For the reason that he feels he has everything. He is sparing in his pleasures for the reason that he would lack for no pleasure he might crave. He's more just than any other man, inasmuch as he provides justice for all. Sorry, there's a weird P there. I don't know why. He delights in labor because he labors of his own accord. Nobody's making him do it, right? He cherishes the laws because he does not fear them. It's a very similar argument to what Paul is making, right? He's like, you're kings, so act like it. Don't act like you're jockeying for position, right? You occupy the highest position in the universe already. Don't act like you're jockeying for goods or social clout. God has given you everything already. So act like it. How much of our aches and pains come because we don't feel like we have what we need to be happy? If I just had this, if this person just liked me, if these people just thought this way about me, if I could just buy these things, Paul's saying, it's yours. Do we have to wait? Yeah. Do we have to suffer in the meantime? Because the world is still under the control of sin and death? Yeah. but we are heirs in God's household, and we stand to inherit everything. So let's act like it. I'm going to pause there. I do have one more kind of segment of things that I want to talk about. But do we have any questions about kind of anything that we talked about so far? Yes, ma'am.
Hold on.
No, I'm sure. Yeah, quit being me. That's the thing. Anybody that knows me knows what that means. Amen, sister. Amen. Does a viable heir, presumably in that time and culture, mean a male? And
Yeah.
if they bring someone in to take that position because one of the sons is acting up, or if he gets straightened out, does he get his position back?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We're
So
going to
the
get into that.
The guy thing
Yeah.
and the
Yep.
positioning thing.
Yeah. No, those are both great questions. So typically, yes, heirs are going to be males. So I should say, there were a lot of expansions of rights of women in the Roman world around this time. And so women did actually typically stand to inherit something from their fathers. And so usually the Roman system wasn't like a single heir system, like you didn't just pick one of your kids. It actually, all your kids had to inherit something from you unless they did something bad, right? And so that included daughters. The thing about that was, so daughters typically didn't like carry the male's family forward. And that's typically because they would marry into another family and then would come into the household of that man, right? And so that's typically why the language bends towards men, right? And so that's why Paul uses sonship language more than he doesn't use the word daughters. He does use children, which is gender neutral, but he uses sons more often, right? And that is because of this dynamic, right? The interesting thing about that, though, is he does apply sonship language to men and women, and so that kind of in Paul's parlance, right? It's like that you are a son of God. As weird as that is to say, right? That you as like women believers in Christ are sons of God. Because you stand to inherit from God in the same way as males do and carry God's family forward in the same way that males do, right? Now, yes, the point of disciplining a child by bringing another heir in the text that I'm referring to in particular was to actually reform that child and welcome them back into the line of inheritance. And we're about to get to that, actually. So, yeah. No, thank you. Those were great questions.
I had a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, two questions. The first question is kind of related to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we're adopted, if the Gentiles are adopted in,
Mm-hmm.
where does the Jewish population come into that? Like,
Yeah.
are they adopted in the same way? Are they more like the child who's being disciplined?
You are anticipating exactly where we're going next, actually. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, don't apologize. I love that you're going there already in your mind. It makes me feel less crazy. So yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, no, so I'll answer those questions in just a minute. Yeah.
The other one was, so acting like everything belongs to you, does that also connote responsibility? Like you're responsible for your things, so you're responsible for all the things?
Yeah, I think I think like good stewardship is like it's a theme in the New Testament, right? I mean, like that what God gives you, you need to steward it well, right? And so yeah, I think insofar as we can say like we have been given things by God, we need to steward those well. And so the adoption language does ultimately point to, like the all things belong to you language does point to the future. Like that's not reality just yet, right? And so like we stand to inherit everything, but like we can't say everything is under our power right now, right? That the phase that we are in the story is like we are living out the death of Jesus right now. right? And so the moment where we're raised from the dead and seated in power over all things is actually still in the future. But I do think that the idea of like what we are given by God in the here and now, we need to steward well. I think absolutely that entails a lot of responsibility. Absolutely, yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, microphone coming.
What was also, I think, mentioned earlier with Moses, if a family did not have any sons, the daughters were able to inherit that. And like you said, if they're sons and they marry out, then it's that family that takes over the patriotic duties
Yeah.
that they were supposed to. But the women are not left out.
No, yeah, the women are not left out, and I would say even more so in this kind of scheme. Like the women are included as the male heirs. Weirdly, right? The women are included as sons. They're included in the category of sons in Paul's drawing out of things. Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point though. Yeah, no. So you do see like some rights of inheritance given to women, even in Moses' legislation. Yeah, that is true. Absolutely. All right. You guys want to move on to part 2 here? So, I'll try to be quick. Okay. So we're sticking in Romans, but we're going to the next chapter here. So Romans 9 through 11, they're some of the most confusing chapters, I think, in the Bible. Like a lot of people don't know what to do with them, right? And I think actually adoption concepts give us some tools to be able to navigate them well. And so just kind of a few preliminary remarks on Romans 9 through 11. So I mentioned this briefly before, but Paul in Romans is writing either primarily or exclusively to a Gentile audience, right? That he refers to himself as the apostle of the Gentiles, and he addresses Gentiles explicitly multiple times. And so he's addressing Gentiles in this letter, right? And that's important because when he is talking about becoming heirs, right? Gentiles becoming heirs of Abraham and of God, of Israel's God, as you anticipated, like that means something because God's household was not empty at this time, right? God had a son, or sons, and that was Israel, right? So another thing, and I know I'm disagreeing with someone that you had in, I believe you had Joey Dotson teach a couple of weeks ago. Love Joey, absolutely great guy. And he's right about so many things. I just don't think this is one of them. And so Joey, I know, thinks that when Gentiles are kind of brought in, that they actually become a part of Israel. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think that's true. In fact, I think why Paul gets his hackles up about circumcision so much, right? So we see this in both Galatians and Romans, right? Why he gets his hackles up about circumcision so much is actually circumcision was a ritual that served to transform Gentiles into Jews. It was a ritual of ethnic transition, right? And I think why Paul gets his hackles up about this so much is he is actually really intent on keeping Gentiles Gentiles, non-Jews and non-Israelites. Because Gentiles had a special role to play in relation to Israel. And that role had to do with their adoption, right? And so their adoption as Gentiles, as Gentile heirs, right? And I think thinking about things this way actually helps us navigate the drastic tone shift that happens between Romans 8 and 9, right? because we immediately go from the passage about, I don't even think the present struggles are worth comparing to the glory, right? We go from that to the Spirit interceding on behalf of the saints, right? With groans too deep for words. And then we go to all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose, right? And then we go immediately to, so what's to stand against us? Nothing, right? Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Absolutely nothing, right? And so you get this crazy triumphant finish to Romans 8, which makes Paul's next statement really weird, right? He just finished on the most triumphant note that he possibly could, and then he goes into this in Romans 9. I speak the truth in Christ. I am not being deceitful. My conscience testifying within me in the Holy Spirit that there's a great sadness, an unceasing ache in my heart. For I myself was praying to be cut off from Christ for my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh. These are Israelites, whose are the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the worship and the promises, whose are the fathers, the patriarchs, and from whom is the Christ according to the flesh. Right? And so we go from this like mountain peak of celebration to this like, I wish that I was damned. I was praying that I could be. Right? Because of the sadness that I have for my kinsmen, for Israelites. And the reason for Paul's sadness, right, is because these are unbelieving Israelites, right? That these are Israelites to whom belonged all these things, right? He names blessings that are theirs because of their relationship to Abraham, right? The adoption is the first one that he starts with, actually. And so this is where I would actually draw a distinction between the Gentile adoption that we have in Romans 8 and the Israelite adoption that we have in Romans 9. So I think the adoption in relation to Israel's history that Paul is talking about is actually the adoption of Abraham. That Abraham belonged to a pagan nation, and God called him out from that nation and that people and made him his own. He adopted Abraham. And what that means is, so in Roman society, right, if you adopted someone, if you adopted a son, and then that man ended up having physical descendants, right, that he actually got married and had biological children, that those children actually belonged to that new family, that they belonged to your family, right? They weren't blood related to you, but they were blood related to the person that you adopted. So they were also your family, right? That they were the next in line for the inheritance after the man that you adopted. And so I think that's actually what Paul is doing here, right? Is actually he's saying Israelites are recipients of the adoption because they are the fleshly descendants of Abraham, God's adopted son. And so they are supposed to stand to inherit all that belongs to Abraham, right? But that's kind of thrown into a tumult because they don't believe in Jesus. They don't believe in the Messiah that has come to save them, right? And so they're actually, because they're cut off from Christ, they're forfeiting their adoption in some way. And so I'm just going to briefly just kind of fly through Romans 9 through 11 here, just give you kind of a bird's eye view. Paul goes on to talk about how not all Abraham's children are Israel, right? Sorry, is that me? That not all Abraham's children are Israel, right? And he proves this because he's able to point to Ishmael, right? And he's able to point to Isaac's children, right? So Isaac had Jacob and Esau, right? But only Jacob actually became Israel, right? It was Jacob and then Jacob's children that became Israel. So, not all Abraham's children actually inherited from Abraham. Not all Abraham's children actually became Abraham's heirs, right? Ishmael and Esau were excluded. And he uses this as kind of a principle to say it's actually the promise, it's the promise made to Abraham that actually narrows down which of Abraham's physical children inherit from him. And he extracts that principle and kind of projects it onto the Israel of his own day, right? Not everybody who's descended physically from Abraham actually stand to inherit from Abraham. The promise actually narrows the number of heirs that there are among them, right? And so the fact that certain Israelites don't believe means that they're not actually recipients right now of the promise. That they don't stand to inherit from Abraham. They've been cut off. They've been actually kind of ousted from his family in some way. And so what Paul goes on to say, or the reason for this, right, the reason that they've kind of been pared down to a smaller number in the present is because they're lacking God's righteousness, right? They pursued a law of righteousness as if it were by works, right? And essentially that, the way in which they were understanding the law made them miss Jesus. The problem wasn't so much that they were exerting moral effort, right? The idea was that their approach to the law made them miss the point of the law, which was Jesus himself. So their lack of faith in Jesus in the present means that they're excluded from Abraham's family, that they don't presently stand to inherit from him. And so Paul juxtaposes the Israel, which is presently unbelieving and therefore excluded from Abraham's inheritance, with these Gentiles, right? That these Gentiles, and he quotes Hosea here, right, go from being not my people to my people. And this is because they did did come to know God's righteousness, right? That they did actually believe in Jesus and receive the Spirit and were able to fulfill the commandments of the law that were given to Gentiles specifically. And so you have this juxtaposition of, you have physical descendants of Abraham who don't stand to inherit from him because they're not righteous. They're not acting like heirs in Abraham's family. And then on the other hand, you have these Gentiles who are not fleshly descendants of Abraham and yet stand to inherit from him because they've been brought in, right? And so that does open up this question, right? He goes through 2 chapters of this, Romans 9 and 10, and it brings him to this really heart-rending question, right? Does that mean God has abandoned Israel? Does that mean God has forsaken his people? And his answer is absolutely not. And he spends all of Romans 11 actually answering that question, right? Why the answer to that question is no. So this is Romans 11 through 14. I say then, did they, Israel, stumble in order that they might fall? Absolutely not. But by their transgression, salvation went to the Gentiles in order to make them, Israel, jealous. But if their transgression resulted in wealth for the world, and their loss wealth for the Gentiles, how much more will their fullness result in these things? For I say to y'all Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I glorify my service if somehow I can make my fleshly kinsmen jealous and thereby save some of them. And so the dynamics that are at work here, right? It's actually, so Israel didn't believe, and so salvation actually went out to the Gentiles, right? That's the reason that salvation went out to the Gentiles initially. It's because Israel didn't respond faithfully. That's the reason that salvation went to us, right? It's actually because Israel didn't believe. And so we actually see this, Paul's logic here kind of working on two different levels, right? So we have it working on the level of God's will, and we actually have it working on the level of human wills, right? So on the level of God's will, Israel doesn't believe in the present because that means that salvation was going to go to all people. The unbelief of Israel actually pushed salvation outside of Israel to the Gentiles. That's the effect that it had. And the purpose of that ultimately bends back to God showing mercy to Israel as well. And that's where the kind of second level of Paul's reasoning comes in, right? On the level of human wills, right? How will Israel's unfaithfulness actually be overcome? It's like, well, through sibling jealousy, essentially, right? That it's created by this situation. That salvation actually going out to the Gentiles is supposed to actually have this effect of making Israel jealous, right? So the idea in Paul's mind is that Israel will actually see their inheritance in the hands of people who aren't supposed to have it. They're going to see it in the hands of Gentiles who are not worthy of it, who aren't supposed to have connection to Abraham in that way. And in Romans 10:19, where he kind of brings up this idea that this is going to make Israel jealous initially, in Romans 10:19, he quotes Deuteronomy 32:21, which is from Moses' song. And Moses is actually talking about the day when Israel disobeys, right? And God actually sends Israel's enemies in to conquer them and to take their land from them. It's talking about the height of the covenant curses, right? The height of the result of Israel's disobedience is Gentiles coming in and taking what belongs to Israel. And Paul is actually saying that's exactly what's happening right now. Gentiles are coming in and taking what belongs to Israel, but not as violent conquerors, but as adopted sons. That God has actually adopted Gentile sons and given them the inheritance that belongs to Israel. He summarizes this kind of complex reality with the image of an olive tree in Romans 11:16 through 24. So he talks about these natural branches, that is, Israelites who have been broken off. And they've been broken off for the purpose of actually being able to graft in these wild branches into the olive tree. We have any like arborealists in here? No? Yeah, me neither. That's fine. But yeah, so it's like essentially, right? You can actually take branches of a tree that are different from the native tree, right? And you can actually use those branches in order to grow better fruit in a tree that's having trouble. And so that's what Paul is saying is happening, right? That these unfruitful branches are actually being broken off. These native branches are being broken off. And wild branches are being grafted in. These Gentiles are being grafted into the tree of the inheritance of Abraham. And Paul ultimately points towards the result that this is going to have when it has its full effect, right? When the full number of the Gentiles actually come in, the hardness of heart will actually fade away from Israel. That they'll be stirred to jealousy in such a way that they'll be like, hey, that belongs to us. And that they'll follow suit with the Gentiles, that they'll also believe in Jesus and that they'll take hold of their own inheritance. That they'll be welcomed back as the son who was wayward for a while, but as it being welcomed back as an heir in the family. And what Paul does say about this is like, hey, I'm telling you, Gentiles, this so that you don't become arrogant, so that you don't start to look down on these unbelieving Israelites or Israel in general, like you're the new game in town, like you've replaced them in some way. Says actually the reality is they're the sons by nature, you're the sons grafted in. Their place is more secure than yours is. So don't be arrogant towards them. Because if God could break off natural branches, what do you think he can do to the wild ones? But he points forward ultimately to the salvation of all Israel. That the full number of Israelites eventually will come in, and that they'll be restored, and that they'll take back, or that they'll take their place, their rightful place, as heirs in the family of God also. And that this is the ultimate effect that our salvation is supposed to have on them. Okay. And so just to kind of sum up everything that we've talked about, so adoption language in general, I think just kind of has these applications, right? So that we as adopted sons are empowered to act like it, right? That it carries with it this kind of moral imperative to act in accordance with what it means to be God's sons, to put to death the deeds of the body, to be aggressive, to be violent towards anything in ourselves that would stand in the way of that, and to imitate our Father in the incredible love that he has for us. That this adoption language pushes us to understand what it is we're actually hoping for. That we actually stand to be co-heirs with Jesus, to share in his administration of rule over the universe. That will help us endure suffering, avoid evil, and to do what's necessary. To do what God calls us to do, to walk in sacrificial love to those around us, right? And it also helps us position ourselves in relation to Israel. That we as Gentile believers don't replace Israel, that we don't become Israel, that we are actually brought in as a result of Israel's hardness of heart temporarily. But the reason that we're saved is ultimately for the salvation and good of Israel, that they would reclaim their rightful place as God's heirs as well. Okay. That's all I got for you. So, what other questions do we have? I know that might have been a different understanding of Romans 9 through 11 in particular than you've heard before. So I'd be happy to talk about. Yes, sir.
This thing about positioning
Okay.
in regard to Israel.
Hold the mic up.
All right. I want to be very careful, with my question.
Sure.
It has led many Christians, in my view, to wrongful understanding of the current situation.
Yeah, I agree completely. Yes.
So they say 1948 is the fulfillment of whatever prophecies, restoration of Israel. So we need to bless Israel, and we need to be totally blind
Yep.
when it comes to what is happening there.
Yep.
And it's not only that it's not fair, but it breaks the hearts of our Palestinian brothers and sisters who are feeling totally ignored.
Yeah.
How can you help us so that we don't fall into of confusing those things? I have no problem, and I could only say amen, that at certain given time, I have no idea how, because it doesn't really look like this at this moment, but at a certain given time, there is going to be opening of the eyes of the Israel,
Yeah.
and many of them coming to Jesus.
Yeah.
But what we are seeing now is not that.
Right.
At least that's from my perspective.
Right. No, I am agreement. I'm in agreement with you. I don't think what Paul is talking about here speaks to the current restoration of the Israeli state, right? I, yeah.
Did, it would be most of from the Jordan to, I mean, Israel, from what's supposed to be in the Bible, is opposed
Sure.
to what they actually call them. So,
Well, yeah, sure. Yeah, no, and I think kind of what you were saying, right? Like what is happening now is not what Paul is describing, right? What Paul is describing is Israel's grabbing hold of their Messiah, right? That it's them believing in Jesus. It's them being made heirs in that way, right? It's not it's not describing like a mostly unbelieving population getting a nation state, right? And so I think, and I do want to be careful here because I don't want to pretend to be an expert on Middle Eastern politics. I think a lot of American theologizing of Israel is very strange because there's this weird thing that happens where we're kind of mostly anti-Jewish in that like we just think the Jews in general are a bunch of legalists like who are trying to like earn their salvation and like or doing things terrible in that way, right? But like have this kind of romance with the nation state of Israel, and like you said, turn an absolutely blind eye. It's like that they can do no wrong, essentially, right? And I think both reflexes are wrong. That I think that Paul's problem with his Israelite kinsmen is not that they're trying to like earn their salvation, it's that they don't believe in Jesus. That's what breaks his heart. And that because of that, they're under God's curse still. And that that whatever you think about what's happening in the nation state Israel, it is not Paul's vision of restoration for Israel. And so I think those are the guardrails we have to operate with. Yeah. No, thank you. That's a great question.
Something I've been wrestling with over weeks, and Lorian can testify to this because she told me just wait, and I think this is the time, is if, you have sects of Judaism, you have Sadducees, you have the Essenes, you have the Pharisees, and we believe in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus Christ.
Yep.
Just because some of the Jews today do not believe that, barring the Messianic Jews, doesn't that just make us a sect of Judaism in a religious sense? Not in a cultural sense, obviously, because we don't follow the Torah and all that necessarily. But
Yeah. So yes, I mean essentially yes. And so and there's actually like a lot of great things that have been written kind of over the last 50 years or so that essentially makes that argument is that like Christianity in its inception was not a separate religion, right? That we're used to thinking of them in completely different categories, right? That we have Judaism as a religion, we have Christianity as a religion, right? And yeah, that is very much how the early Jesus followers saw themselves, right? Is that they were Jews, most of them, right? And that they were experiencing this kind of restoration that had always been promised to them, right? And so the question that does come up when Gentiles start coming to believe is like, what place do they have, right? And I think the answer that ultimately is given by the Jerusalem Council, as we see in like Acts and by Paul, is they're actually they become related to Abraham in some way. but as Gentiles, right? That they become heirs as Gentiles, right? That they are brought in to share in what belongs to Israel, but like very paradoxically, as the nation still. But yes, and so that I think if we're to think about this in the terms that the New Testament uses, yeah, I think that we are participating in what is ultimately the restoration of Israel. Yeah. That's a really good question, yeah.
Okay, I have a question again.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your kind of explanation, because I wrestled with that passage, exactly what you're talking about. I read it
Yeah.
like 5 times and I was still
Yeah.
kind of uber confused. So
Yeah.
a lot of things were clarified, but I guess kind of my thoughts were, is, you were pointing towards Paul wanted Gentiles to maintain their ethnicity. Did that also mean that Jews were expected to maintain their ethnicity? Like they still, even if the law points to Christ, so they still fall under the law, whereas Gentiles from a ethnic perspective, they were not subject to that necessarily.
Yeah, that's another really wonderful question. So essentially, I think the answer is yes. I think in Paul's conception, he doesn't have a problem with Jews practicing the law, right? That his invective against like works of the law in Galatians in particular, and we do see in Romans to an extent, right, is against primarily circumcision, keeping certain feasts, and Sabbaths and things like that. And so it's things that the law did not require Gentiles to do. And so, yeah, and like, I mean, if you just think about it in this way, he's really crazy about people not being circumcised too late for Jews, right? I mean, like, they already were. And so, yeah, he doesn't have a problem with that. That's a good thing, actually, right? That his intention is actually to keep Gentiles. And I think, I would argue, definitely to keep Jews and Israelites. Because I think and I think we see in this passage, they both have their own unique role to play in relation to one another. And so, I think he very much thought that they should stay kind of within their respective ethnicities. And that did carry different requirements in relation to the law. Because I wouldn't actually say that the Gentiles aren't obligated to keep the law at all. So if you read Acts 15, right, the decision of the Jerusalem Council, the directives that are given from the apostles to Gentiles are like, hey, yeah, you don't have to keep the requirements of the law, except don't commit sexual immorality, and don't eat food offered to idols, food that is strangled, or food with the blood. And what's really interesting is all 4 of those commandments are actually found in Leviticus in relation to foreigners who are dwelling in Israel. So non-Israelites who are dwelling in Israel. And so you almost, what you're seeing is there's this expectation actually that Gentiles do need to keep the law, but only the commandments that apply to Gentiles specifically. And in that way, they'll actually be kept within their respective ethnicities. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. Does that kind of answer what you were getting at? Okay.
I'm gonna end us, guys. It's 8:30. We gotta get out of here and let the security people close up shop and everything. So it's not that like we want to cut off conversation. It's that other people inhabit this space that we want to honor their time.
Sure.
So thank you, Kyle, so much for doing that. Make sure that you grab a textbook on your way out. If you have not grabbed the new one yet, there's some over here. There's a few on this way out as well. Grab one of those, and we'll see you guys next week.